Assalamualaikum students. Today we are going to discuss about the second hormone that is released from the posterior pituitary, and synthesis take place in the hypothalamus, that is the oxytocin. As we discussed that the hypothalamus has two nuclei, that is the paraventricular nuclei and supraoptic nuclei. These are the magnocellular nuclei in the hypothalamus that cause the synthesis of hormones. So the hypothalamus neurons, these are called the magnocellular neuron. These are of two types. One is the oxytocin, this is the paraventricular, and the second is the supraoptic. These are the two nuclei in the hypothalamus that cause the synthesis of hormones, and as we discussed, the oxytocin and ADH. These are synthesis in the hypothalamus, and then these store in the posterior pituitary. These send to the posterior pituitary and they store there until they are required in the body. जब तक ये बॉडी में रिक्वायर्ड नहीं होते, ये वहाँ पे स्टोर रहते हैं. ठीक है. दीज आर न्यूरोपेप्टाइड इन नेचर. हमने बहुत सारी टाइप्स डिस्कस की थी पहले लेक्चर में कि हार्मोन्स कितने टाइप्स के होते हैं. कोई न्यूरोपेप्टाइड्स होते हैं, कोई न्यूरोट्रांसमीटर्स होते हैं, कोई एंडोक्राइन होते हैं, न्यूरो एंडोक्राइन कुछ होते हैं. तो दीज आर द न्यूरोपेप्टाइड हार्मोन्स. They are synthesized in the hypothalamus, then these sent to the posterior pituitary where they store there and then release when they are required in the body. Then when they require in the body, the posterior pituitary release these hormones in the systemic circulation, and from systemic circulation these travel to their target cells. Now, as we discussed, the oxytocin has release in the body during two functions in our body. One is the during labor, during giving birth by mother, and during labor when the baby comes out of the mother's womb, then it contracts the cervix as a part of the reproductive system of the mother. If we suppose this is the womb of the mother and the baby in it, not my drawing is not very good. Baby when comes out, wants to come out, it contracts the cervix. As the contraction of the cervix is the stimulus for the posterior pituitary to release the oxytocin. Okay, it is the stimulus for the posterior pituitary that please to release the oxytocin. Send signals to, sorry, it is written wrong. It is not send signals to hypothalamus, it's send signals to the posterior pituitary, as the oxytocin store there, and oxytocin synthesis take place in the hypothalamus. Okay, so this is written wrong. Hypothalamus sends signals to the posterior pituitary. Okay, then the posterior pituitary release the oxytocin, and these oxytocin travel from systemic by the systemic circulation to the target cells, and the target cells for the oxytocin is the uterus of the reproductive system in the mother. these travel to the uterus, and after uterus has the receptor cells for the oxytocin, and after connected to the receptor cells, bind to the receptor cells in the uterus and cause the uterine contraction. Bind to uterus receptors that are for oxytocin. Then this oxytocin cause the uterine contraction, and this uterine contraction push the baby towards forward, that again contract the cervix, cause the contraction of cervix. And as we discussed earlier, that the cervix contraction is the stimulus for the posterior pituitary to release more oxytocin, and this is we call the, as we discussed in the previous lecture, that is the positive feedback. Again more oxytocin release from the posterior pituitary to the uterus, cause the uterine contraction. This uterine contraction cause the pushing the baby toward forward, that cause the contraction of the cervix. This contraction of cervix again cause the posterior pituitary, stimulus for the posterior pituitary to release again the oxytocin, and this process is continued until the baby birth take place. Until the baby birth take place, this process is continued. Okay. Now this is the one function, first function, that is the during labor. Now the second function of the oxytocin is during lactation, that is the milk production from the breast. If we repeat, is that the oxytocin released from the posterior pituitary travel by the systemic circulation to the uterus, uterine contraction cause the pushing the baby, again contraction of cervix, and cervix then again stimulus for the posterior pituitary to release the oxytocin. Now the second function, we are going to discuss the second function of the oxytocin, that is the milk production from the mother's breast. That is lactation, feeding the baby. Okay. If we see the structure, that the